Shalom, God's beloveds. Today our topic is human behavior, drivers behind motivation. Now in the previous video I shared with you that motivation can come from two areas, threat and rewards. Now let's call the above two as force or the push factor towards motivation. Let me introduce to you the drivers for motivation. So what does it mean by drivers of motivation? It is the prioritization that controls the direction of your motivation. Another way of putting it, it is the direction that the motivation takes you. Now, there are two drivers of motivation. Let me introduce to you the first one. I mentioned in the earlier videos that there is threat and rewards. That's the push factor. So you have a motivation. These are the push factors, the threat and rewards. They will be pushing you towards task. So task is one of the driver. It drives you on the road, and that is task oriented, or motivation that is task oriented. Then the other driver is people. So there's this path that brings you towards people or people oriented motivation. So these are the two drivers of motivation. Whenever we say what are the drivers of motivation, we would say that there are two drivers. One is people and the other is task. Today, I will share with you the sphere of motivation that is made up of these two drivers. So let's look at the right-hand side diagram, a sphere of motivation. So you can see here the sphere of motivation has two sides, task and people. We can say motivation is driven by task or people. So now let's look at the driver behind motivation as people. So when a person is driven by motivation as people, we call them people-oriented. People who are people-oriented, they tend to focus on people rather than the job at hand. It means that when you talk to them, they usually focus on people instead of the job or the task. They would want to please people. They want to understand how people felt about the task itself and not just finishing the job. Yes, finishing the job may be a priority, but people has a higher priority. So these are people who are motivated by the driver people itself. In other words, these people may be easily influenced by opinion, or they can be more sensitive and emotional in approach. Now let's look at the other driver that is behind motivation, and that is task. We call them task-oriented people. Task-oriented people tends to focus on job to be done or goal to be accomplished rather than looking into the needs or the desire of people. And these task-oriented people are less influenced by opinions and more logical in their approach. So, God's beloved, let us revisit the interaction sphere which I've covered in the earlier videos. In an interaction sphere, we have two different groups of people. One is an outgoing and the other reserved. So let's say if these two different groups of people come together, what would happen? It would lead them to irritation, inconvenience, or misunderstanding. So what is an example for irritation? So let's say an outgoing and a reserved person goes to a formal meeting, and the outgoing person may speak in such a manner that is not as per a meeting format. It means that he's informal in his speaking or in his behavior or even in his dressing. So what will happen? The reserved person will find it an irritation to himself. He will not be able to accept the outgoing person's behavior or even the dressing. Now, for inconvenience, it would be like two persons who are to do a job, and the job has 4 steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4. For a reserved person, he believes in following the rules. So he will take the step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4. As for an outgoing person, he may not find it the same as what the reserve would see. He may find that the step 3 could be omitted. He can jump from step 2 to step 4. and he may find that the reserved person has created him inconvenience, even though step 3 can be omitted, but he is required by the reserved person to also do step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. You see? So a reserved person follows the rules. The outgoing person do not follow the rule, but according to what he finds or could understand. Now let's take the next one, misunderstanding. Let me share with you an example of misunderstanding. So let's say a reserved person is to observe an outgoing person. The outgoing person he may be a guy who is meeting a girl, and they are not boyfriend and girlfriend, but instead they are just friends. And this outgoing person may come to the girl and just hug the girl. So for the reserved person, he may find that the outgoing person is either taking advantage of the girl, or he may find that the boy is a playboy. So you see, it can cause a misunderstanding. So in between these two different groups of people, if they come together, it usually leads to irritation, inconvenience, or misunderstanding, or a combination of these few. For God's beloved, let's look at motivation sphere. In this video, I mentioned that motivation spheres have two drivers, and they are tasks and people. Now, the task-oriented people tends to look towards tasks to complete it at all costs, and the people-oriented person will look at people, the needs of people, more than task itself. So when these two different people come together, the task and the people-oriented, the difference in them would lead to conflict, tension, and stress for both of them internally and with one another. And this stress, tension, and conflict are far greater than the interaction sphere, the people, the difference between the outgoing and the reserved person in the interaction sphere. Now, on task and people-oriented, this is where the majority of serious disagreement is found. So if you have task-oriented people and people-oriented people coming together to resolve an issue, you will find serious disagreement here. So let me give you an example. So let's say a company loses money, and the company wants to increase their profit. So what would happen? For a task-oriented person, he would push for more, maybe free overtime, getting the people to work overtime and not paying them. Or he may think of retrenching people instead of making the work more efficient, because people is just a cost to a task-oriented person. Whereas the people-oriented, they will be different. They will think about compensating the people first if there is any retrenchment. And for the people-oriented person, they may even think of how do we stand together to overcome the problem of an issue, and not just looking at the issues and taking people as part of the issue. So you see, when these two groups of people come together, surely the disagreement in the approach will bring out greater conflicts, tension, and stress than the difference between an outgoing person and a reserved person. God's beloved, we come to the end of today's lessons. The next lesson will be on the 22nd January, that's a Monday, and the topic will be questions of motivation. In the next video, I'm going to ask you questions, and you're going to think and submit your answer to me. It is on human behavior, combining motivation and interaction. It may be also a follow-up of the earlier question that I given to you from the interaction sphere. So God's beloved, until we meet again, let us declare together, no fear, no compromise, abiding in the Word of God, led by the Spirit of God. Shalom, Emmanuel.